Well, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for your attendance. My name is Damian Murphy. I'm an enterprise technologist or field CTO with Dell, and I work in an OEM division of Dell. So we make the Maritime components that Dell sell to help customers, deliver solutions in ports, on ships, and around the world. So we focus on telco, industrial, healthcare, defence, and maritime particularly. And so the reason I'm chairing this one is I actually said to Kathy, this is an area of great interest to Dell, and probably to everyone here, and you may not realise it directly, but we're in an unprecedented time in our lives where the supply chain is more constricted, more busy than we've ever seen it. If you want to order a computer today, it's harder than it's ever been. There's a shortage of chips, there's a shortage of components. My company has done really well out of it. Dell has got the best supply chain in the world. We've taken share, but this whole thing has disrupted industries. Car factories have shut down. Equipment is not available. So everything today is dependent on our supply chain. And when we look ahead, it becomes more and more dependent because industry is changing. So I'm actually here as an interested participant in the outcome that these gentlemen are going to be talking about, and I'm glad to say that they all know more than I do about this. So I want them to introduce themselves and briefly sort of say how they see this enablement of frictionless supply chain coming about.
Sure, I'll go first, and it sounds very good, a frictionless global trade ecosystem. So I think we had a bit of an intro. I'm Joshua Kroeker. I'm from Contour. In the last panel, Bertrand mentioned the financial supply chain and the physical supply chain. And really, if we want to have a frictionless global trade ecosystem, we need both of these to both be frictionless alone, and more importantly, for the common customer, the reason why we're all here, for the importers and exporters that need both to function. So in the financial supply chain, it's also paper-based, but it's not our fault. I'm going to put the blame maybe elsewhere, but we're going to work together to solve the problem. So in the financial supply chain, I have a long history working in banks and trade finance. We want to finance the buyers and sellers, the importers and exporters in the world, and we ask for evidence of these transactions before finance happens. We don't ask for paper, we ask for evidence as banks, and that evidence does come invariably in paper. So there's been this long industry-wide sort of push to say, why is this evidence in paper? Surely we can have digital evidence. But again, it's not just evidence. There's also things like title and title transfer that are important both in trade and trade finance. These are all problems not for any one of us to solve alone, but for us to solve together. So what Contour is we are a global network. We were born out of collaboration of the both corporate trade world and the trade finance world. So we were founded by 8 large trade finance banks. We're headquartered here in Singapore. We've been in production now for over a year, and we are now scaling up over 50 countries. We have 16 banks and over 100 corporates who are now using it. And that number needs to grow, of course, a lot. But looking forward to talking more about it, and that's who we are. We're a network, and we're an application that streamlines trade finance and has connectivity into the physical supply chain.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Oswald, and I'm the Managing Director at the International Chamber of Commerce. For those of you who don't know, the International Chamber of Commerce, we represent over 45 million businesses globally, and we're over 100 different countries, and we have over 10,000 chambers. And so how we got involved in this conversation was at the beginning of the pandemic, we had a look at global trade, and we realized that we were all still stuck on paper. And the key question that we asked ourselves is, what can we actually do to help accelerate the journey? We know that we started as a global community digitizing trade documents about 22 years ago through applications like Bolero, for example, and 16 years ago through applications like SDocs. And we've seen a lot of the great innovation that organizations like Josh's have brought when it comes to use case enablement using technologies like blockchain. But the key question was, why aren't we seeing it scale? What is actually holding it back? If everyone agrees that digitization is important, what can we actually do as the ICC to help unlock that? And so we started the Digital Standards Initiative, and that's how I know both of my co-panelists, with a specific focus on looking at the critical path items that are holding us back. What are the elements that the private sector can do, and how do we solve that in a collaborative way? And what can the public sector do, and how do we solve those? And so looking forward to the conversation, and please submit some difficult questions for us. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. So I'm Antoine Cadoux. I'm representing SG Tradex. And so we are a public-private partnership, public-private joint venture. We are incorporated last year, in September last year, and we are born out of what was called in Singapore the Alliance for Action on Supply Chain Digitalisation, which is also, a public-private initiative, industry-led at a time, during COVID, where, Singapore realized that, okay, we need to do something differently, and therefore bring the entire ecosystem together to think through, what should be done to digitalize the supply chain. And the conclusion of this initiative was to say, okay, we need to start by exchanging data between all the stakeholders, whether it's the financing institution, whether it's the shipper, whether it's the carrier, whether it's the licensed bunker supplier, regardless of their maturity, there is a need to exchange data, to consume and exchange data. And therefore, we are building this sort of data layer or data infrastructure. So think about it as a data highway, where all ecosystem participants can sort of plug and play and exchange data in a secure, seamless, and inclusive way. So that's our mission and what we are trying to do now. We're going to go, live by April 2022, so in a couple of months. And we have a couple of use cases that we are deploying, working again, very closely with some of the public agency, MPA. We mentioned earlier, this bunkering use case, and I can talk a little bit more about that later.
Thank you. So I think I want to build on one of the topics that was brought up by Bertrand. You talked about collaborate, you talked about working together. So how do you see collaboration in this space? And I guess, is it working? Is everyone collaborating? What more needs to happen? I mean, how do you, and each of you have a different lens on this, so how do you see collaboration?
Sure, I'll go first, and please jump in. So I think collaboration is sort of two things. So I think one, as an industry, you have to work with your competitors. If each of the competitors in an industry all decide they want to digitalize, but they want to do it with their favorite platform, with their little favorite fintech, then you're not going to build the network. So you do have to actually work with your competitors, and technologies that are decentralized, we talked about blockchain in the last panel, do help that because you can keep data separate, you can keep it encrypted. Bertrand talked about how important that is, and that really helps to see competitors collaborate. And I think that's step one, because you're much more powerful as a group when you go out and say, this is what we're using as an industry to your common customer group. The next thing, which is maybe less sort of obvious, is you need to then think about your customer and what they do after they're done with your service. So the sort of trade, supply chain, value chain, whatever you want to call it, is quite long, and it starts before you get involved, and it probably ends after you're involved. So think about what comes before your piece of that value chain and what comes after, and think about how you can collaborate with that piece, because it really is links to a chain. And once we start thinking about that end-to-end journey of an importer, of an exporter, of a trader, and all the different things they have to do, and how data can go from one platform to another in a really streamlined way, then we're really going to make headway towards driving that end-to-end digitization that we all want. So this isn't something any one solution can provide. It's going to take collaboration amongst them as well.
Yeah, and I think to build on what Josh said, the way I look at collaboration is really in two parts. So the first is in the private sector, and the second is in the public sector. So when we think about, again, what are those key things holding us back of ultimately achieving scale, it's our ability to all talk about similar things in a similar way. So whether it's bills of lading, whether it's legal identity, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we ensure that in the private sector, as we jump from platform to platform or from industry to industry, we don't always have to go and translate the same data fields from one way of talking to another. So the first area that I personally believe in the last 3 years we've seen enormous progress on collaboration is we've seen not just within specific industry verticals, people collaborating closer together to say, what is our norms and how do we digitize that? But we've also now seen people across industry starting to come together. So for example, in our advisory board, we have GS1, we have IPCSA, we have the WCO, the WTO, et cetera, all kind of sitting together going, how do we do this more efficiently? And I think that's the first pillar that I would say I can truly see. If people ask me what's different today than 2-3 years ago, I can see various industries working together with the likes of BIMCO and DCSA to say, how do we do this? On the public sector side, when you think a bit about e-commerce, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this, but the United Nations had a model law for e-commerce that got launched in 1996. And if you look at the uptake of that model law over a decade, and you have a look at the volumes of e-commerce, they go hand on hand. And so if you think about the model law for electronic transferable records, the ability for us to actually go from electronic physical records to electronic, this is hugely important, but we did not see collaboration and we did not necessarily see scale in that space. And again, so when you think about collaboration, what we've seen over the last year or two is various countries working together, various organizations like the UN, the Commonwealth, ASEAN, all working together trying to figure out, well, how do we actually enable that legislative foundation so that we can get rid of paper? And so that, to me, if I think about collaboration, the private sector working closer, cross-industry borders, and the public sector actually saying, how do we accelerate this journey when it comes to legal reform? Boom.
All right. So, I mean, the way we think, I think about collaboration, it's really about exchanging information between the various participants and therefore exchanging data. And we've seen that the way we look at technology or data sharing has changed drastically in the past few years. Correct. So it's from something where I protect everything to a much more democratized approach to sharing data. However, the way we are picking up and the way we are fostering this collaboration, it's anchoring the problem back to value. What sort of value can I create for the various participants if they were to collaborate and share data? So I think this element is very important. It's about collaboration. It's about win-win type of situation where it's a positive sum game, where by sharing data, I'm going to create more value for the entire ecosystem, and I'm going to solve a problem or a challenge for the industry, and therefore benefit from that. But you need to see this value lever to foster collaboration.
Okay, I think that's very interesting. I'm going to come back to you now, but so what's changed in the last 2 years? And you're obviously the key candidate here, because your organisation came into being. So obviously there must have been change that drove that, and I would expect that's a response to something. So what do you think has changed significantly in the last 2 years?
So what we've seen is obviously COVID. So if you think about COVID, and the way the supply chain has been working, it was really based on paper. Now you see that you need to digitalize, correct? So that's it's a fact. It's a fact of life. You need to digitalize. You cannot only rely on paper, and you not only need to digitalize, but you need to create resiliency in the supply chain to be able to respond to other shock. All right, and to create resiliency, you need transparency, and therefore you need to exchange data. So that's the COVID impact, I think. What we've seen also, and maybe Josh can talk about that in the trade industry also. We've seen a couple of fraud cases, and a couple of trade financing bank, going bankrupt. And so therefore the conversation has also changed from being purely on efficiency improving the operation, becoming paperless, to more of risk management. How do I mitigate risk? And therefore, one of the key to mitigate risk is obviously to remove paper from the process, because paper is prone to fraud. So I think those two components happen over the past few years and are already fueling this digitalization effort that we see currently.
Yeah, I'll add to that maybe a little bit. So I think absolutely. I think 2 years ago, banks were interested in experimenting with technology and maybe seeing what the value could be. We don't actually talk to a bank anymore that needs to be convinced they need to digitize. It is because of two things. One, from efficiency, but also from fraud reduction and for growth, et cetera. Because it must be hard to realize this, but even though global trade has grown tremendously in the last few decades, trade finance revenues haven't. And a lot of that is because they haven't moved on with the times. Their product is really hard to access. So corporates are more and more saying, I don't want to deal with giving all this paper. Just give me a regular line of credit facility. Give me something simple. Even if that's less money or less growth capital, I'll take it because it's not worth the pain. So I think banks have now realized that. But I think for the corporates, I think what they need to now think about is, how do I change my process? And that's sort of this next world, because everyone wants the end state. Everyone wants everything to be digitized. But the middle state, where a little bit of it's digitized, some other parts of this value chain haven't fully got there yet, that's challenging, because it may not even be more efficient to start. So you have to actually get worse sometimes before it gets better. And that's a really bad sales pitch. But that is a bit of the expectation setting. I think a lot of things have to happen. And I think more people are sort of realizing that now and are sort of getting on with the journey. And they're saying, yes, I understand it's not a silver bullet, it's not perfect, but it's more understood, and they're willing to sort of keep pushing ahead in the midst of that. I don't know if you're seeing the same.
Yeah, I'm not sure about your organizations, but generally, if you look at all the projects every year that you get requested to fund, there's more than what your budgets kind of allocate for. So you generally do a prioritization process, and generally speaking, it's the ones that unlock the most margin that are the ones that get funded, right? Outside of the R&D space. And I think for us, if you think about the last 2 years, is two things really happened. The first is that a lot of your business continuity plans got executed, and a lot of those business continuity plans you had digital. And when you think about the internal organization and how you collaborate with your own teams, those were relatively simple. People went, okay, I'm going to get MS Teams or whatever it is, and that's how I collaborate internally. And then the question was, okay, well, how do I collaborate externally? And that's where a lot of, the solutions that these two, gentlemen represent, they provide. The second one is that when you think about that prioritization process, we've gone from risk being theoretical to risk actually hitting people's balance sheets. And I think that's the other reason why we've seen a lot more both headcount and funding going into this space. Now, the reality is, we still haven't necessarily seen the successes that we have, but I think to Josh's point is it's a change management journey, right? So as we go through this, a lot of people are expecting, but I can just collaborate with my external community at the same speed that I could my internal community, and that's not the case. It requires a little bit more work. But upside is there's a lot more use cases of value that can actually drive that.
I want to build on two things that you talked about there, and that was that the organisations, right, and the second is the change in the business. But I guess first, the organisations. Oswald, I believe I've read online recently. It wasn't an email from you, admittedly, but that you're working on 100 governments across the world to bring them on. Obviously, governments, key stakeholder. Banks, key stakeholder. The organisations in this room cover ship owners, charterers, organisations making hardware, making ships, making communications equipment. What role do these different organisations play in achieving this digitisation?
I'll kick it off, and then So I think a few things. So I think the first view from, at least from our side practically over the last 2 years, is what we realized was that a lot of the digitization of trade and supply chain processes were driven really by the shippers, right? And the carriers kind of came along in their journey. One of the key things that we've kind of evolved in this period was actually saying, no, the EBL is a carrier, it comes from the carrier. So how do we actually work closer with organizations like BIMCO, DCSA, and FIATA to say, let their members actually go and define these new EBL standards, work with standard authorities, and then bring that back to, for example, our banking commission to say where we have in the financial space rules and practices like EUCP for letter of credit processes, let's make sure that's compatible with what is being defined in the carrier space for EBLs, as an example. So I think that's the first one. And the second one, so again, it's through your leadership that we'll get those EBL definitions so that we can actually leverage them. Now, what can you not do? This is where regulation comes in. We need to make sure it's legal, right? We need to make sure that as you go from that physical paper to digital, you can actually go to a courtroom and go through the processes when you need to. And that's where Singapore has just been absolutely phenomenal. If you look at it, Singapore has adopted the model law for electronic transferable records. If you look at what MPA and all these organizations are doing, they're all giving us a very good sense of what is possible. And so to your point on the 100 countries, that's where our view is, if we can take that same energy that we can find here and we can internationalize that and say, how do we get more countries involved? Because international trade's about at least 2 countries, right? Then we'll see more success in this space. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, no, I think we should give them some incentives. So I think everyone here should be incentivized by growth of global trade. And I think what everyone, I think, will realize is that a lot of global trade requires finance. So having more access to finance allows for more growth of global trade. And it's not just growth at the whole, it's actually growth of participants. I would say that the growth of global trade has not been all that inclusive. It has definitely gone towards the higher end, the larger corporates, more than it has the smaller corporates. And I think all of you have higher margins when you sell to a smaller corporate than you do to a larger corporate. Trade finance is really, really useful to growing corporates in developing markets and developed markets around the world. It's what they need far more than large corporates who have access to lots of capital. They don't really need trade finance, to be honest. So if we want global trade to grow and we want that growth to be inclusive, making trade finance digital, more accessible, easier to understand is in all of our best interests. So all you have to do is simple. If somebody comes to you and says, I need a piece of paper from you, just say no. And then give them a digital alternative. Or say, if you want paper, I'm going to charge you an extra $100 per page unless you choose this digital alternative. So we'll just create the incentive structure that we need for the world to digitize, and it will. I think change is hard. If we get the incentives right, it'll happen.
So I think there is also a common goal that everyone share. So it's to make the supply chain and trade industry, more resilient and more efficient. And so all organizations, I believe, in this room can, sort of align with this goal. And therefore, after it's, we need, obviously, business leader and a bit thought leader, to drive the change. Once, a couple of large organizations, great leadership will drive the change, then the rest will follow. The ecosystem will follow. So it's kind of identifying who are the queen bee, who are the anchor, both on the public and the private sector that can drive the change and sort of rally the rest of the less advanced organization around this mission and this vision.
Well, I guess then I look at the last thing here, and then we want to ask the audience for some questions and some opinions, but. I look at my own organisation and I'm, doing something that's moving things between countries and so on, and I've got to deal with taxation and trade compliance and lawyers and supply chain in Dell, and these are all separate groups. And I kind of go, well, are we going to be ready for this when it comes? Because they're all silos in my business. So I guess the question I've got is, do these people in front of us have to start changing their organisations? Are they ready for it? You've already had some wins.
Yeah.
You've already had some successes. So from the wins you've seen, from the pilots, from the things you've got out there, what works? What's a problem? What has to change?
So I'll give a quick answer. So I think the reason that change has happened is the problem that you just mentioned, which is you have these silos in your organization, you have your logistics, you have your finance teams, and everyone has their own systems, and nobody talks to each other, and it's all paper. And I think what people have realized is that there are solutions out there today. There's actually more solutions out there today than what a lot of people realize who are ready for your business. So what I would do is maybe an internal project is look at any time you're asking for paper or any time you're giving someone paper and think about why. And if you look at the alternative to that in every one of those instances, I guarantee you will find an alternative that is available today in the market that will drive change. It just requires a bit of change from the status quo, because I guarantee you have people in your offices that really like that paper and they know exactly what to do with it, but they may not know what to do with a platform. So I think it just requires that sort of process, and it's happening. Lots and lots of major commodities firms have removed paper from 90% of their process, and we're just looking for that change now to sort of keep coming down into lots of different industries.
Yeah, and I think the use cases might also be different per department, right? So if you think about, for example, warehouse and inventory, like if I go digital, I can potentially reduce the amount of inventory that I hold. If I go to a sales team, it might be that I can extract new revenue or additional revenue out of my customers if I have ESG data points, et cetera, et cetera. So without kind of duplicating what Josh said, I think, the solution's already there. Scaling is a different conversation, but the solutions are there. We need to build capability, new digital capabilities in each of these departments, because the reality is the way that each of them have done their business is going to evolve, and it is going to change, and new value is going to be generated. And the last thing that I'll just add to that is I'm a big fan of data analytics, AI, all of these new paradigms out there, and I just don't believe that the quality and the reliability of the data that we get off paper scales well when we think about all of the additional value we can unlock. So as you're thinking about how do we address and solve trade digitization, and you're thinking about the value across the different departments within your organization, also think about the holistic value that you'll gain when you can actually get access to quality and reliable data. A lot of the reporting that you're doing will improve, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of change management in the organization, it's also about how you approach the problem and how you execute around that. So, I believe it's a lot about speed and execution now. So, people are impatient to show result, and therefore, even if the problem is large, it's about cutting the problem in small pieces that you can really demonstrate quickly that you are solving it, and use that as a marketing tool to rally the organization. So, the way you structure your program is super important for its success.
Kathy, how are we going there? Is the online audience asleep?
We've got a couple of questions. You ready for them?
Yes, I think. I haven't seen them yet, so I can't guarantee we are.
Okay, so you have a question that's come in off the floor. Sorry, the virtual audience is, what are the major barriers or resistors that you have come across, and how do you resolve those?
Yeah, no, I think maybe the barrier that I talked about a little bit was that you have to convince a lot of people to change what they're doing, right? And change is hard, it's not natural. And there's not an instant gratification in digitization that people sort of expect. It's a long-scale process change. So the most successful companies that I've seen do it, unfortunately, it's been a top-down, where you have the senior management team says, I want all the printers in this office to be turned off in 18 months. It's all your jobs to now figure out how to do it. And then it happens. If there isn't that type of sort of mandate, it's easy to find an excuse or say, I want to wait for this or I want to wait for that. But I think it's just natural resistance to change. I think there's solutions that are out there. I think It's now just about scaling and finding the right incentives. And if there isn't, we can start a company. I heard there's lots of money from those VCs early today.
Yeah, so what we see, you know, when we start talking about, you know, sharing data, so you have some trust-related sort of barrier to adoption. Okay, what are you going to do with my data? Is the data secure? Will you send my data to my competitor? Which we have, you know, frankly, very good answer for that. So we don't see that as a big issue anymore. And then you have also, you know, technical or technological barrier. And that it's related to, okay, what's the cost, change management in the organization, as well as sometimes a little bit of a fear of being, you know, locked in with one platform or one solution. And so there is a tendency, what we see sometimes in the market, also people that are willing to wait. They are waiting for the next greatest innovation. So it was blockchain, now it's NFT. In 6 months, it's going to be something else. So, you know, the technology discussion is sometimes derailing a little bit, you know, the ability of the participant to act and really solve business problem. Okay.
Yep. And I'll just add two small things. I think, in addition to that, is I feel sometimes that the barrier that we place in going to digital is way higher than paper. It's like there are risks around paper that we all accept today, that the second technology platforms come into the fold, you know, the barrier for entry is so much higher, right? Even though the risks are way greater in paper. So I think that's one, as a part of that change management dialogue, that it almost has to be perfect before we can go. And I think the second one is just understanding the value proposition. A lot of people still think about the value of trade digitization as just a working capital conversation, and they don't realize that actually there's about 30 different use cases across an organization that this can actually enable. So allocate capital, allocate people into your own organization to get it going.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions from the floor? We've got approximately 1 minute. No, I think
so if there are no questions, I mean, it's a little bit of a call for action. You know, I think from all of us, you know, we are willing to engage with you. We are willing to, you know, look at industry challenge and industry problem and see how, you know, collaboratively we can solve them. So please reach out.
A question for you. Who would you be wanting to reach out to you? Who would you be asking to come and, say, collaborate with?
So we are, I mean, for us, you know, we are looking at the entire ecosystem, you know, so shipper, importer, exporter, the asset operator, whether it's the carrier or terminal operator, the service provider, also, you know, 3PL, 4PL, financing institution, as well as the government agency. We really want to connect this entire ecosystem. So we are not discriminating here. We are open and willing to engage everyone.
I would say for us, it's very simple. There's only one thing that banks really need from the sort of shipping industry, which is an electronic bill of lading. They just need to remove that original full set in triplicate. It gets rid of LOIs. It gets rid of all kinds of complications when you don't have paper bills of lading. So the electronic bill of lading is the thing that the banks are waiting for sort of mass adoption for.
And don't give up. We're not going to be on paper in 100 years, so it's going to happen. The question is when.
I think we should have renamed this the war on paper. I think from my perspective, one thing from something else I look at is that we look at, you know, Industry 4.0 and Industry 5.0, and Industry 4.0 is about digitizing factories. Industry 5.0 is about something called hyper-customization. If you order a Tesla, you specify everything. You can buy a shirt online today that is made for you. This is where industry is going. And for that, the supply chain becomes integral to that business. So our supply chains globally will transform more in the next 10 years than they have in the last 100 years since we got trains and containers. That's where we're going right now, and we're seeing the first elements of that being deployed today. So that term was coined by German Chamber of Commerce about 18 months ago, 24 months ago. That's what comes next. That will drive this industry. It will drive global supply chains for the next 10 years. And that's what this has to happen to make that possible. So, you know, the war on paper begins now.